Welcome to our next episode. In this episode, we're going to take a look at how we can identify whether or not any of our computers are connecting to another organization's wireless access points. In our last episode, we talked about how it is that we need to make sure that we have secure wireless access points deployed within our own business, realizing that using a pre-shared key with WPA or WPA2 is not enough. But can we also determine whether or not our computers are connecting to someone else's access point? We're not simply talking about an unauthorized access point in our environment. That's easy enough, and most of us realize that perhaps it's necessary to walk around with a wireless sniffer and find those unauthorized access points, or perhaps even use our network vulnerability scanner with the appropriate signatures to see whether or not any of the web browsers that are supported by those systems are running. But if the wireless access point is on someone else's network, then how do we find it? Why is this a problem? Some might wonder, especially people within your business. Well, if your computers are connecting to someone else's access point from within the business, you could again be looking at a data leakage problem, but there's a more fundamental problem. Why would someone in your business connect to someone else's access point? You might think, well, they have internet access at the desk. Why would they bother? There are a few reasons. It could simply be convenience. For instance, perhaps that access point is accessible from within a conference room. But a much more common reason is that that other access point allows that individual to do things on the internet that perhaps your proxy server does not permit. Or perhaps they're involved in something that they'd really prefer to be anonymous about while they're doing that activity. And connecting to someone else's open access point allows them to do just that, while also potentially exposing their system and your network to additional problems. So how can we find them? We have some really easy tips. And to talk about this, we're actually going to be taking a look at some of the NetBIOS information that's available on your network. Now, there is a Microsoft TechNet article that explains how NetBIOS names are represented on the network. So if you'd like the real technical details of this, you could take a look at this article, which we'll include in the show notes for this episode. But what's more interesting for us is how the NetBIOS names are represented on the network. What we're looking at right here is some of the output from the TCP/dump sniffer. I just ran it for a little while on a network just to show you the normal kind of thing you'll see coming out of NetBIOS machines. But as we go through this episode, don't be concerned that, oh, if we're going to be using a sniffer, that sounds like it might be out of my area of expertise. Because the way we're going to use it is extremely simple. Notice here that in the packet decode, it includes all kind of information, among which is the name of the resource that's being pulled for. In this particular case, if I scroll up just a little bit, this is actually a NetBIOS response coming from one of the domain controllers that we have on network. But if I go up just a little bit more, we'll find that the packet before this was a broadcast query trying to find Enclave Forensic. Enclave Forensic is actually our domain name. So the point is that if you're running NetBIOS, which if you're running Windows and you have Windows sharing enabled in any way, you will be running NetBIOS. Then you'll find that your systems will be broadcasting your domain name periodically on the network. Each machine actually does it pretty regularly, unless you have a Wins server running. A Wins server would eliminate this kind of activity. There would also be other kinds of NetBIOS traffic. For instance, here's one machine advertising its name, Win764. Up further, let's see. We have another one named, I know there are more here if I can find them. Here's one for Workgroup. So that's a machine that is not in any particular domain. On your network, that might be an interesting thing to find internally. Here's another one where a machine is looking or is named vSphere and is talking out on the network. But this is on our internal network, and frankly, this particular output is really too difficult to work with. What about on the wireless network? Well, on the wireless network, what we could do is simply use a wireless sniffer to collect some data ahead of time, and then search for that data within the wireless information. Let's begin by just taking a look at a capture that I pulled out of a wireless packet capture, and this capture was simply created by using the Backtrack DVD booted up on a laptop, turning on the wireless promiscuous mode, and then just capturing data. There is no need to connect to anybody's access point. We simply collected the data for a period of time. And if we use the strings command is a command that allows us to extract out printable strings out of packet captures or pretty much anything. We see here a whole bunch of printable data that becomes available. So I want to be clear that rather than trying to read this data using TCP dump, which certainly we could do, it's much easier to simply extract out the printable strings. So again, we'll just put those strings out. You can see printable strings, but where do I find those NetBIOS names? Well, NetBIOS names are these things right here. NetBIOS names on Windows workstations are actually encoded, which is what that Windows Knowledge Base article is about. The encoding they use is a little unusual. We don't really need to get into it too much, but you can see that you can't clearly tell what that machine is. There are other things we can read. We can see iPhone, we can see let's see, local, ARPA, Paul Lines iPhone. So there's a lot of readable text here, but I really want to zoom in on those NetBIOS names. In order to do that, let's do a little bit more with this strings command. If I wanted to zero in on those, I could begin by just looking at how long they are. For instance, a NetBIOS name is used to represent a 16-character machine name. The machine name that you can assign is actually only 15 characters, and then the final character is actually reserved for the system to use to define the kind of resource. If it's a domain controller, if it's a network group, if it's a workstation. So we're looking at a 16-character name that's been re-encoded, and when that encoding happens, it expands it out to 32 characters. Well, we can use that. For instance, if I just tell it to use strings and find things that are 32 characters long. So the dash option followed by a number allows you to specify the length of a string that we must find in order to print the output. And I'm going to simply run that against that wireless packet capture. Instantly, we have reduced the amount of data that we see. We can see that we have almost all NetBIOS names, though there is still some other information included in here. Some kind of WLAN forwarding update and some universal plug and play. We see some SSL certificate information, but we have found the NetBIOS names. How can I strip that down even more? Well, if we wanted to zero in on just that information, we could use a regular expression, maybe using the grep or the egrep, extended grep tool, to pull out just those lines. What would that look like? Well, we could take this output again and put it through the egrep tool. Now, most people are very familiar with grep, get regular expression, but I encourage you to explore the egrep tool. I prefer the egrep tool because it supports a much more full-featured set of regular expression notation, including the ability to do more extensive sets and easier to write sets. Instead of having to write complicated regular expressions, for instance, we could say, I want to find everything that contains alpha num. Just like that, which would be a much easier way to represent alphanumeric with a really simple set. In our case, we're not looking for alphanumeric. What I'm looking for here are lines that have very particular characteristics. So inside of quotation marks, because I'd like to represent a space, for instance, I'm going to look for lines that begin with a space. Now, if you're not very familiar with regular expressions, there actually is a section on this in one of the courses I teach, and there are great references you can find out there on the internet. But I'll just tell you the way that you could write this particular one. Notice that each line with the NetBIOS names begins with a single space. To begin or to search at the beginning of a line, we can use the caret symbol. That indicates beginning of line. And we're saying the beginning of the line should have a space on it, and that space should then be followed by, and in here I'm going to put a set, because what follows that is going to be a capital letter, but it could be any letter from A through P. Well, to represent that set inside of these square brackets, I'll simply say A through P, and then I'd like to indicate that there needs to be at least one. So the plus sign can indicate one or more. And if I run that again, we find that now our output has really cleaned up, and the only thing that we're finding at this point are the actual NetBIOS names. Well, that's great, but how do I interpret those names? Because right now they're still encoded. And unless you're going to become a human NetBIOS decoder, that doesn't look very usable. Well, the answer is that I'm a big believer in trying to automate tasks as much as possible so that if I need to do something once or twice, there's a need to turn it into a script. And in many of the courses I teach, we spend some time teaching some of that scripting so that you have enough ammunition that you can start automating tasks as well. In this case, we've got a script that we're going to make available to you. You can get access to it through the show notes, which we'll put up in just a moment. It's this netbios.pl. It's a very, very simple Perl script that simply allows us to push all of this data through, and with every line that it sees, it will decode that into the NetBIOS name. Now we can clean up that output even more, so let's take that output and we'll run it through the sort utility, and then we'll put that through the unique utility, so that we'll only see one copy of each. And now we very quickly can zero in on exactly what NetBIOS names we're seeing. In this case here, I don't see my domain name, so I'm pretty happy about that. Previously, I mentioned that if you have a Wins server running, you will not see your NetBIOS names necessarily broadcasting on your network. But I want to be clear that if you're looking at an unauthorized wireless access point, or perhaps you're looking at your people connecting to someone else's access point, that's not going to be a concern. Because when they're connecting to that other access point, they're not going to be talking to your Wins server. So you will still see those NetBIOS names coming by. In here, I can see different machine names. I can also see group names. For instance, here's the MS Browse. This is an election request to find out who the master browser is. We can see a work group. We can also see a request for WPAD, which is an attempt to find automatic proxy settings, which is one of the ways that we can run into trouble with our machines. We'll talk about that in a future episode. If we were to see Enclave Forensic, I would know for sure that one of my systems was connecting to this unauthorized or external access point without permission. The script that we talked about here, the netbios.pl, is a very simple script. But rather than keying that script in, you can find that if you go to the show notes for this particular class. Let me just get out there at audit.sans.org/blog. And the very first or most current article, Can You Hear Me Now?, that matches this episode, you'll find a link to this script, and in addition to the command line we just used to extract that data, right in the show notes. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to send me an email, and if you have suggestions for future episodes, we're always willing to hear them.